Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this Star Wars ATST, or ATST if you prefer. This model is the 1/48th scale plastic kit from Bandai, which I built, well, a fair while ago now, but it was the first Bandai kit I put together and it was a really enjoyable build. If you would like to see the build video, there's a link in the description, and on the card in the upper right corner of the screen now. Enough of that, let's get to it. I began by priming the entire model with black Stynel res, though you can of course use any primer you like. Then, once the primer had sat and cured for a bit, I usually like to leave it at least a day, I airbrushed on a base coat with Vallejo Model Air light grey. I have no idea if this is the correct, in heavy quotation marks, colour to paint an ATST. I just went with what I thought would look good and that I already had on hand. I didn't really want to order any new paints for this. It's probably obvious to say, but I'm giving the entire model a good solid coat. Well, multiple coats really, because it is preferable to do multiple thin coats and build up opacity than it is to just glob on a thick layer. Next, I airbrush on a highlight using model colour Sky Grey, the idea being to create a subtle suggestion of light hitting the walker from above. I'm going pretty lightly here, partly because I want it to be subtle, but also because doing thin coats will stop the paint from building up in the movable parts of the model and sticking them solidly in place. I have already put the walker in the pose I want it, but it is nice to be able to change that later if I choose. This highlight is kind of hard to see on camera. Like I said before, it's kind of subtle, but it is there. I add further highlights with a brush. In this case, it's a contour brush intended for makeup. If you want to see a video talking more about this brush, there's a link in the description, and probably in a card in the upper right. The colour I've used here is model colour Sky Grey mixed roughly 2 parts to 1 part Model Air White. I'm just dry brushing this onto the hard edges and some of the upper surfaces all over the model. Like the previous highlight, it's subtle. A little bit less subtle than before, but still subtle. That's the sort of thing I like. And I didn't want to go too overboard with very stark edges that jump out too much. Just a little bit of jumping out is what I want. I do plan to make this kind of dirty later on, but dirty, not damaged, and I want the paint to look pretty well looked after. That said, I did decide that another highlight would be a good idea, so I did a bit more dry brushing. This time, the mix was roughly 3 parts white and 1 part Sky Grey. It was at this time that I'd realised the horrendous mistake I'd made by leaving these shieldy things, I guess you might call them, off the model. I don't remember if I mentioned it in the build video, but at least only one person pointed it out in an abusive manner. I suppose there's always going to be at least one representative of the group that makes people think Star Wars fans are weirdos. Anyway, it wasn't too hard to glue the parts on and get them painted up to match the rest of the model, and then continue with the dry brushing, which is pretty much the same as the previous layer, just a bit lighter and more tightly focused on the edges. I think the result is pretty decent. A wash or filter or whatever you might want to call it would make the lines and recesses pop a little bit more, but I'm going to leave that for later and do it with the enamels because why not? But before we get to that, there's a couple of things I wanted to pick out with the acrylics first, because having the entire model being grey isn't the most visually interesting. So the next thing I did was to paint the cockpit joiny thing. Whatever this thing is, it was painted with Vallejo model colour black grey. I paint the majority of it pretty roughly, but I changed to a smaller brush and tried to be careful around the bottom where it connects to the, whatever you would call this midsection. Then, why not add some black grey to some of those hoses? I have no idea what these are meant to do, and I've chosen which ones to put this colour on at random. It is a bit fiddly to get at them all neatly, but not impossible, and we can always make corrections later on anyway. I also applied this to some of the cables on the bottom of the cockpit because, well, for the same reason I did the other one, visual interest and variation. This little cable on the back running between what looks to be Panther fans was kind of fiddly to do, but I feel like it shows that you don't have to do too much to break things up and add some interest. Sometimes less is more. Keeping with the black grey, I painted this bit in the centre of the rotation point for the blasters on the front. No real reason for this other than why not, which is as good a reason as any. Then, still with the black grey, I decided it was time to try and add some interest to the cockpit, so I painted this set of panels. I'm trying to do this neatly, but as you can imagine, it is a bit fiddly trying to paint inside the cockpit. It won't be especially visible, but I'm trying to be neat anyway, and again, corrections can be made if needed. I also painted some other odds and ends inside the cockpit. Not too much though, like I said before, sometimes less is more, and I think this is one of those times, especially considering the only way we're going to see this stuff is through the small hatches on the front and the roof. Back to the exterior of the ATST, I paint some more cables. This time I'm using Vallejo Model Air Sea Grey. This is kind of close to the base colour, but it's different enough that the cables and other greeblies I might paint with it will stand out just a little bit. As before, I'm trying to be careful with these cables because I would prefer not to have to come in and make corrections, but on the other hand, I'm not going to beat myself up too badly if I do. After all, everybody makes mistakes, especially me. I didn't just paint the cables, I also applied this colour to the raised rectangles in each corner of this presumably removable panel, and these little cylinders on the underside of the cockpit here. I don't know what they do, but now they're this colour. Also the tops of these boxes, but not the sides because of reasons, I guess. I also painted the whatever this part of the weapon mount things might be called. I did this on both sides of the model for symmetry reasons, even though what's mounted on those points isn't really symmetrical. The rest of the cockpit is. I also painted the blades on these fans, which look as though they might have come from Panther tanks. I figured doing this would add a bit of depth. I also used the sea grey to paint around the edges of these doodads. To add some more interest to the cockpit, I decided to pick out a few things with random colours. First, I used Vallejo model colour Vermillion, and I'm just picking out a few random bits and pieces in here that look like they might be lights. Are they lights? Are they even meant to be red? That question is rhetorical, I don't care. This is just meant to add a little bit of something to an area that will be visible, though barely. I'm not going for a screen-accurate replica here. I do the same thing again with Vallejo model colour light yellow. I figure that's a colour that things might light up, though it isn't super bright and doesn't really stand out that well. That's okay, it's still there, and you can still see it. Finally, I used Vallejo model colour lime green and did the same thing again. Obviously I'm not painting the same spots again, that would be silly. I'm picking out separate little bits and pieces for each colour, and I am trying to apply them in places where I think they'll be visible from the outside. Otherwise, what's the point? I also decided, why not paint the seats? I used Vallejo model colour brown sand here because, well, I was looking for a brownie colour, and it was already on my desk, so that's what I used. That sort of colour selection method is bound to upset somebody. Leave your outraged comments in the comment section below. Then I thought, why not just have the tiniest bit of colour on the outside? So I took some model colour red and painted this little section of cable. Maybe this is a very important cable that you should never cut, or something like that. I also added a spot of that red to these little round things on the rear wall of the cockpit, and this pair of little nub things on the underside, and I think that might be enough of that. It's very easy to go overboard with this kind of thing, so I stopped before it got out of hand. How responsible. Next I dry brushed the hoses or cables or whatever they are, using Model Air Light Grey. I felt like this was the most appropriate colour, but being a very thin paint, it's not exactly suitable for most dry brushing applications. I think it worked pretty well here though. I did the same around the raised bits at the central round cockpit mounty thing. I went a bit heavier with the dry brushing here, but not too heavy. Just enough that it's no longer a single colour, and so that it looks like it's had a bit of wear. While I was looking at some pictures for inspiration, I noticed that somebody had used a metallic colour on the tips of their guns, and I thought that looked pretty good, so I decided to do that as well. I've used Vallejo model colour gunmetal here because I thought that would be a decent, relatively dark colour that shouldn't jump out too much. I apply this to the ends of the blasters, and the front of the, I think this is a grenade launcher? Whatever it is, it has model colour gunmetal painted on the front of it now. I also applied some to the doodads on the cluster of things on the left side. I also decided to use it on the tips of those, what appear to be secondary guns on the main gun mount, because why not? Once all of that had dried, I applied some gloss varnish to protect the acrylic paints from the coming enamels. But first, I painted the crew. For the base colour of their uniforms I used model colour stone grey. I did use a reference image for these, but when it came time to choose the colours I went with a near enough is good enough approach. I'm not going for screen accurate here, so in the end it doesn't really matter. Then I used model color brown violet for the strapping. I'm obviously trying to only paint the straps, but it did go on pretty messy. Oh well, that's what touch-ups are for. I used the same colour for the helmets because, well, they looked pretty close to the colour of the straps in the image I used, and this saves precious moments not choosing or mixing a new paint colour. Skin came next. I used AK Interactive Light Flesh here and applied it to the faces, because that's where the skin is, obviously. I did consider doing highlights on all of the colours used on the crew figures, but then I figured they will be enclosed inside of a dark space, and it probably wouldn't be all that noticeable, so I didn't. I did, however, paint the visors with Model Air black. These are raised up from the face quite a bit, so it's easy to avoid painting the skin. It isn't quite as easy to paint the helmet straps on, so those were a bit messy, but again, touch-ups to fix mistakes are a thing. I finished the figures off by painting the ends of the arms black. I'm not sure if they are wearing gloves, but I decided to paint them as though they are wearing black gloves. I painted the boots black too because why not? Nothing too challenging here, it's pretty obvious where the boots are. Now, the weathering begins. I'm using enamels here as I mentioned all those moments ago, and I started with AK Interactive Landing Gear Wash. Please insert joke about there being no landing gear on the model, and how rebellious it is to use landing gear wash. I'm putting this all over the walker and thinning it out on the model, so there's no consistent thinning ratio or anything like that. I just apply the wash straight from the bottle, and then apply thinner and spread it around. I am applying this fairly heavily, maybe a bit too heavily for some, but I am trying to make it look quite dirty, but not damaged so much, which is why I didn't bother with any chipping or scratches. But I do want to make this look like it's been out and getting dirty and grimy for a while. I figure it makes sense to brush this stuff on, and probably more importantly, brushing it off, in downward strokes. There will be streaking, and it makes sense for those streaks to be running down the model to look as though rain and gravity have done what they usually do. With the roof sat on top of the cockpit part, you can see how much this has changed the way the grey looks, and I was pretty satisfied with this effect. To be fair, I think it looks a bit better at a distance than close up, but that is kind of the idea. Here you can see how visible the crew are, which is not very, not unless you put it right under the light. The little bit of painting in there has worked out pretty much how I wanted it to, which is nice. It seems as though the roof doesn't want to go all the way into place, and I might need to scrape some paint off the mounting points to get a better fit, but that's something for future Herbert to worry about. I've not glued the roof into place, so I can fix that at any time. In the meantime, I decided to add some more enamel effects. I applied AK Interactive Exhaust Wash, thinking it might look interesting around what I'm assuming to be exhaust vents. I am applying this a bit lighter than the previous colour, but the method is more or less the same. Put the enamel on the model, thin it out and remove what I don't want with a brush with thinner on it. Simple enough. I didn't apply this to only presumed exhausts though. I put some around the base of the connector thing, mostly trying to get it around the gap there, but I did put a bit on the front as well. I guess this is kind of working as a random stain colour, just to add a bit of interest. Because I put this on the lower half of the walker, I figured this colour might as well go on the upper socket connector thing as well. And these vent things on the back of the cockpit seemed like a good candidate for it too. As you can see, I've streaked this down the back of the cockpit, which I thought would look interesting. It almost looks like rust or something. Maybe something in the atmosphere of the planet this thing is on reacts with the residue coming out of this vent or something like that. The reality is, of course, that I thought it would be interesting, so I did it. Next, AK Interactive Engine Grime. I've applied this to things that look like they might move or accumulate greasy, dirty stains. Again, application is the same as the other enamels, and it is obviously a pretty simple technique. I think the main thing to keep in mind when doing this kind of thing is to apply the colour in places that make sense. Like for this colour, mostly moving parts where maybe lubrication would leak out, causing dirt to stick to it, getting all gross and grimy. The same goes with removing it. If we assume that this thing is in an environment with gravity, then it doesn't really make a lot of sense if the dirt and grime is streaking upwards, for example. On the back of the cockpit, you'll see that I've used this as grime in the hinges of those flappy things at the top, and in the ribbed things at the bottom. I think this works well here to add a bit more colour to the dirty areas, to make it a bit more than just grey tones without it being too colourful, if that makes sense. I also applied it around the weapon mounts because they seemed like moving parts, and why not? Otherwise, I left most of the cockpit relatively clean. Well, clean of this colour anyway, it's still very dirty. At this point I was pretty happy with what I had, and couldn't think of anything to do that wouldn't be going too far, in my opinion. I did consider adding some dirt and splatter marks around the feet, but I haven't yet decided what I want to do with the base, and as you can probably see, I've left it plain. The main reason for that, other than my own indecisiveness, is because I want to build more of these Bandai kits, and I want to have their bases match, so it makes sense to do all of the bases at the same time. I think I might do a separate video about that when I get around to doing it, but for now I applied a coat of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish, and that is the AT-ST by Bandai painted. Obviously it's not the most complicated or fancy paint job ever, it's mostly just a few shades of grey, but that's how the AT-ST looks. Grey. I'm pretty happy with it, though looking through the video there are a couple of bits and pieces I might have done better, or could change, which is the case with pretty much everything I've painted. And there is always the option to go back and change those things. You can always do that. This is the way we get better at doing things, by reflecting on what we've done and making changes in the future so that our models better match what we want from them. The same goes for everything in life, really. Anyway, I think I've got a pretty cool looking model here. It's not screen accurate, or well, I don't think it is. I haven't checked because I don't care. I painted this for my own enjoyment, and making something accurate for other people's pleasure was never a concern. I'm sure at least one angry Star Wars nerd is going to let me know about all of the flaws in it anyway. What matters to me is that I enjoyed the process of painting the model and am happy with the result. Though to be fair, I did take a pretty long break midway through painting this because I just didn't feel like painting. That's part of enjoying the process though, doing it when it's enjoyable. Forcing myself to finish a paint job when I don't feel like painting, or barely have any free time, just to have a video makes it a lot less fun. So I paint when I want to, and I avoid burnout that way. I don't get paid anywhere near enough to do this and be miserable while doing it. I'm sure most people probably get that anyway, and at this point I'm just waffling. But I suppose that just gives more time to watch the AT-ST spin around and around and around. Anyway, if you're interested in what colours I've used in this video, there's a handy dandy list of all the colours I used in the description below. Obviously if you're painting one of these yourself you can use any colour you like. I would like to suggest pink. If you've already painted one of these and you'd like to share, feel free to come on over to our Discord community and show us some pictures. That would be excellent. Doesn't have to be an AT-ST either. Share any of your models. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section below. I hear it's pretty good for that. And if you've not done so already, why not subscribe, follow, ring the bell, become a patron or YouTube member, or maybe just come say hi on Discord or Twitch. And if you're feeling really helpful, why not share this video around with your friends or anybody you think might get something out of it. Links to all of my things are in the description below, and as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.